Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start with a little bit of updates about the playoff talks, some new twists and turns that we want to get to because some things might be changing, or I guess not changing for the time being. It's very possible that they will not be expanding, at least in the short term, for the playoff. And then we're going to jump into the Missouri spring game. They had a very, very early spring game on Saturday, and a couple of takeaways that the guys over at SB Nation had, and also that I had from watching some of that game. And then we're going to jump into part 2 of Instant Impact Freshmen. There are tons of guys across the country that are either going to have to play big roles or might slowly build into a role throughout the season that I definitely want to get to, because in part 1 we did not even get close to covering all the guys. And then we have a Good Vibes Monday for you all. And I think today it's only fitting to talk about Aaron Donald, one of the best football players, period, that I've ever seen play. Recently retired from the NFL, so want to take you through his career, high school, into his time at Pitt, and then obviously off into his incredible NFL career. But before we jump into all of that, I want to remind you all we get a lot of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get involved and see your questions or comments on the screen, and we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all, because it makes this show a little bit more interactive, get to see your name on the screen, and maybe I can answer a question that you have about the topic that I'm talking about. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. Alrighty, let's jump right in. The playoff obviously has been a big topic of conversation throughout last week as they were trying to get a new revenue distribution deal into place. There were a lot of moving parts in that, a lot of different ideas being floated around the room, but they finally landed on one. And it looks like the 9 FBS conferences and Notre Dame have approved some revenue distribution models through 2031. Now, this does include a look-in clause in 2028, which we'll get to a little bit later in the segment, so that could mix up some things here in a couple of years. But overall, this is a very, very interesting topic because it has been hotly debated for a very long time, and there has been a lot of people worrying way more about the revenue aspect of things than the format. And if you're the people in that room, it's hard to argue with that approach, partly because there are a lot of conferences that need pretty much as much money as they can get their hands on right now. So they have been fighting for quite some time about the details of all of this, but it seems they finally come to an understanding. Everyone has agreed to the details of it, and if you don't recall the details from a week ago or you just didn't watch that episode, I'll break them down here real quickly. We have 29% annually go to the Big Ten and the SEC each, so each of them will get 29% of the pool. 58% will go to both those conferences together. Obviously, a big piece of the pie for those conferences. That would be about $21 million a year, it seems, per school. Then you have 17% to the ACC. Second highest or I guess third highest, but second behind the Big Ten and the SEC, around $13 million per year for schools, and then 15% going to the Big 12, $12 million each, and then 9% to the Group of Five conferences collectively. It says about $1.8 million per school, but prior to this agreement, they were distributing it kind of at their discretion, so I don't know if that's going to be continuing on into this next era of things. And then the remainder of those independents, including more than $12 million for Notre Dame and the FCS. So a very interesting diatribe of all of the different options for all of these teams and what they could possibly be taking home. One of the interesting things that has been added into this new revenue distribution model is there's additional performance benefits available only to independents for making the college football playoff field. So Notre Dame in particular would make an additional $6 million if they were to make the playoff. So that would take them right up there around the Big Ten and SEC mark, around $18 million a year. So would be a huge thing for Notre Dame, obviously, if they were able to pull that off, and keeps Notre Dame right where they usually are, among the richest and most successful brands in all of college football. So they definitely have to be happy about the way things shook out, because there were a lot of people thinking they had to join a conference to get a fair cut of the pie, and they did not, very obviously. But there's been a lot of push back and forth between the Big Ten and the SEC and pretty much everyone else, especially the Group of Five. And as we talked about last week, there was not much of a choice from the Group of Five, or really from the ACC and the Big Ten, on this matter. It was a lot of the SEC and the Big Ten kind of just forcing their hand on the Big 12 and the ACC and the rest of the group. So there's been a little bit of, I don't want to say necessarily bad blood in these discussions. I don't think there's anyone walking out of there super surprised, but there's definitely some people that are less than excited about the way that things went and the way that things are going in this sport. And I think it's kind of summed up by a quote that was in an article by The Athletic. Stuart Mandel and Chris Favini have been doing incredible reporting on this and released an article last week about the most recent developments. And a Group of Five athletic director who was granted anonymity for discussing the negotiations said it's like playing on a football field while also being able to change the rules and penalties during the game and controlling the officials. It's simply incredibly brazen, unnecessary, and dangerous. So there is not a lot of fans of the Big Ten and the SEC right now, and I totally understand that. I think there is a certain level of, the way he put it, brazenness in the way that the Big Ten and the SEC approach these conversations, and the way I'm sure they're going to approach them for, the next couple of years as we get closer and closer to that look-in clause in 2028. So there's a lot of not too happy people in that room, but they don't belong to the SEC and the Big Ten. They got pretty much exactly what they wanted in a lot of ways. Obviously, that first round bye for their conference champions was stopped in its tracks. Excuse me. But other than that, they've been pretty much able to entirely control these conversations, and obviously it's rubbing some people the wrong way, which makes total sense. But also, from the SEC and the Big Ten perspective, you have very little motivation to worry about any other conference than yourself. You see the power dynamic that is forming in college football. You see that you are sitting up top, and if you have the ability to make the decisions, it'd be really hard not to if you were in their positions. Although I wish that they would be able to put that aside and, do what's best for the sport and keeping everyone involved. But as of right now, there's not much incentive for Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti to do that. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that happens. But we knew about all of the revenue distribution. We knew all of this was coming, and we knew some of the specifics towards the end of last week. So one of the really new developments in this that I think is really interesting, and I wish they would have came to this conclusion earlier, is it looks like they could be putting talks on hold to expanding to 14 teams until they see the 12-team playoff play out for at least 1 year, because obviously all of this stuff has happened very quickly. First, we had the 12-team playoff in a 6+6 format. That changed to 5+7 before we saw 6+6. And then it was going to change to 14 before we saw 12. So there was going to be a lot of moving parts very, very quickly in this process. But at the end of the day, I'm very happy that they've decided, at least some of them have decided, to stay the course for the time being, see what 12 teams look like. Greg Sankey was someone that is in big favor of waiting until the end of the season to reopen these conversations and see what they want to do from there. Now, that's not to say that at the end of the season they won't still be expanding to 14 or 16 teams. I think that's almost definitely what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, we at least get them to sit back for a second and stop changing the format of something that hasn't come to be yet. So I think all of us can be okay with that and at least let the 12-team play out and see what happens. Obviously, one of the big things that has been happening throughout this time and throughout the last couple of years is the Pac-12 has been slowly being kind of squeezed out in the grand scheme of this stuff. I think Oregon State and Washington State, although they have decided they're going to operate the Pac-12 as normal for the next 2 years, they had to sign the new thing on Friday, but there is a rule by the CFP that says you have to have at least 8 teams in your conference to get an automatic berth. So both those teams are really only up for at-large bids. And I think, as some of you might know, but just to remind you, it looks like they're going to be playing Mountain West teams the majority of the year. They likely, the conference championship won't necessarily matter too much depending on whether Oregon State or Washington State wins it. It doesn't necessarily make that big of a difference. So it's hard for me to look at either of these teams and say they're going to be a big part of the new playoff, which really stinks because unless they can add some Mountain West teams and maybe be able to kind of backfill a little bit and create some type of Group of Five-esque conference, it looks like Washington State and Oregon State are going to be sitting on the outside looking in at least for the next 2 years. Bill Hancock said the same thing, who has been a big part of the college football playoff throughout this entire time. He says, as of now, it is not anticipated the Pac-12 will be a part of this in 2026. So it's very possible that these next 2 years are the last 2 chances that Oregon State and Washington State have to be even involved in these discussions if they don't, create a conference out of thin air from the Mountain West or any of the other leagues out there that they can poach teams from. And there are some strong teams in those conferences, so they could definitely put together a good conference, but they got to get moving pretty quickly. And right now they don't necessarily have a lot of pull, no matter who you're trying to call, whether it's Boise State or any of the teams up there. I don't think Oregon State and Washington State have too big of a leg to stand on as of right now. But as we talked about earlier, the big part of this is the look-in clause in 2028. I think all of us understand the way the sport is going. The SEC and the Big Ten are garnering just about as much power as anyone has in the sport pretty much ever. So there is a certain level of worry that once we get to 2028, it's not going to be, reallocating things a little bit more evenly. It's going to be pushing it more and more in the direction of the Big Ten and the SEC, mainly because the ACC and Florida State, their case is starting to come to a head. I think they were waiting for the playoff discussions to kind of settle down and let everyone kind of regroup, but I think all of that stuff is going to be happening very quickly. I think Florida State wants out as quickly as possible, obviously, and the ACC, I think, might be getting a little bit tired of fighting this fight. So I think Florida State will find their way out. I've said that a number of times. I think with enough money and enough want in college football, you can do any number of things. So the people at Florida State really want out, and the people at Florida State have plenty of money to do so. So it's hard to argue with that. I think once Florida State does it, a lot of teams will follow them, depending on what that dollar number is to get out of their grant of rights. But there are a lot of teams out there in the ACC that would go into a little bit of debt knowing that they're going to the Big Ten or the SEC, where the payouts from the media deals will be substantial and be able to cover that throughout the next couple of years and cover that deficit that they might have to take on. But all of that is for a future thing. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are getting ready to be into a bidding war, be into kind of picking up as many teams as possible, the gold rush as we have called it around here. And I think Florida State, obviously chief among them, that looks like a Big 12 or Big 10, lock at this point. I think Florida State, if they're going anywhere, it's going to be the Big 10. I think the SEC has a number of teams they'll look the way of. I think Clemson is the number one team to watch, obviously, there. I think they fit the SEC perfectly. I think a lot of things make sense from that marriage. I think Miami also could go to either one of them, but I think the SEC makes a little bit more sense. North Carolina, Virginia, there are tons of teams to watch, whether they go to the Big Ten or the SEC. It looks like they're just going to keep consolidating power, and then come 2028, I'm sure that number that they want will not be 29% annually. It will be closer to 40 or closer at least to 35, because the amount of power they could have by 2028 could be just insane compared to what they have now, even with how much everything's changing and how fast everything is consolidating, these guys are going to be able to dictate a lot of the future of college football. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out and what 2028 brings us. But for the time being, we have a 12-team playoff for 2 years. We will let it play out before we get to 14. Hopefully, I think there's still some people pushing to continue talks, but hopefully they'll let it play out for 1 year, see where they're at. Then they'll likely go to 14, and in my mind, and then likely to 16. So I don't think this is necessarily going to stop anytime soon, but it is a rest stop on the playoff expansion journey. So let's enjoy it. Let's enjoy this 12-team playoff for the 1 year that we probably have it, or the 2 years at least that we have it. But let's enjoy not having to worry about it expanding too quickly and too fast, at least for the time being, it seems. So good news on the playoff front. We're one step closer to getting some real answers on what the future of college football looks like, even though it might take some time. But for right now, I think we're at a resting point, at the very least, with these playoff discussions, and we'll see when they pick them back up and if they pick them back up before the end of before the start of this next season. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk Missouri spring game. There was a very early spring game on Saturday in Columbia, Missouri, and there's some really big takeaways that I had, and I really want to jump into this because this is a team that is very dangerous in the fall if they can put a lot of things together. So stick around with us, and we will be right back with that.